This show is a part of the podcast network of the Walled Garden Philosophical Society, an international community of philosophers and seekers dedicated to the pursuit of truth, wisdom, virtue, and the divine, wherever they may be found. To find out more, go to thewalledgarden.com. Hello and welcome to another episode of Soul Searching with Seneca. Today we are focusing on verses 19 through to 21 of Seneca's 24th letter on despising death. And in these verses, Seneca is bringing in this idea that we've actually discussed before on this series, but nonetheless it's such a great idea that it's so good that we need to revisit it multiple times and hear it again, because it can really help us to think about death in a completely different way, right? And so I'm going to stop rambling about it and I'll start reading what Seneca says, and then we'll see what we can kind of take away from it. So he says, quote, "Allow me at this point to quote a verse of yours, first suggesting that, when you wrote it, you meant it for yourself no less than for others. It is ignoble to say one thing and mean another, and how much more ignoble to write one thing and mean another. I remember one day you were handling the well-known commonplace, that we do not suddenly fall on death, but advance towards it by slight degrees. We die every day. For every day a little of our life is taken away from us. Even when we are growing, our life is on the wane. We lose our childhood, then our boyhood, and then our youth. Counting even yesterday, all past time is lost time. The very day which we are now spending is shared between ourselves and death. It is not the last drop that empties the water clock, but all that which has previously flowed out. Similarly, the final hour when we cease to exist does not of itself bring death. It merely of itself completes the death process. We reach death at that moment, but we have been a long time on the way. In describing this situation, you said in your customary style, for you are always impressive, but never more pungent than when you are putting the truth in appropriate words, not single is the death which comes. The death which takes us off is but the last of all. I prefer that you should read your own words rather than my letter, for then it will be clear to you that this death of which we are afraid is the last but not the only death." End quote. Okay, so like I said at the start, this is an idea that we've discussed from Seneca before, but nonetheless it's such an interesting idea and such a different way of thinking about death to how we usually like to think about death, or how we usually have habitualized ourselves into thinking about death, right? Because often we will think that death is kind of this thing on the horizon. You know, we think about the event of death, whereas Seneca is kind of pointing out to us here that death is something that happens every single day. It happens at every moment in our lives. You know, he actually says here, I think this is a beautiful way to put it, that counting even yesterday, all past time is lost time. The very day which we are now spending is shared between ourselves and death. That's a beautiful way of putting it, right? That each moment, each day is, you know, we're kind of sharing it between us and death. That's what's happening. And so really what he's trying to do here is to shift our perspective and get us to see death from a different angle. We seem to always think that it is something ahead of us, something on the horizon, right, that is kind of coming towards us. Seneca's saying here, no, this is actually something that's behind you as well, right? Every moment is shared between yourself and death, and all lost time, right? That is time that belongs to death now. That is your dead past self, essentially. Such an interesting way to see it, right? And he said that it's not the last drop that empties the water clock, but all that which previously has flowed out. Similarly, the final hour when we cease to exist does not itself bring death. It merely of itself completes the death process, right? So again, changing our perspective, not seeing death necessarily as just some event on the horizon, but seeing death as a process that every single human being goes through from their birth until that event of death, right? It is the very process that we are going through. And so we've talked before about how Seneca believes that we need to actually learn how to die. We need to learn how to come to terms with this fact that we are constantly dying. We need to learn how to deal with this process called death that is constantly happening throughout our lives. And I would say that certainly it has been the case for me that one of the most important elements of learning how to die, not that I think that my work learning how to die is anywhere near to being close, right? That'll be in the final analysis. Then you'll be able to see, did he go out kicking and screaming, or did he go out with a sense of honor and calm? But nonetheless, I've certainly felt that as I have understood more deeply that this is a fundamental process, it's a thing that is constantly happening to me. As I've understood that, as opposed to viewing death as this boogeyman in the future, there is a certain sense of calm in knowing that it is simply a process that is a part of you, and it's a fundamental part of the cosmos within which you are a part of. And so I get the sense that Seneca would have got a feeling of calm and peace within himself, be at peace with death, knowing that death is not, as I said, some boogeyman in the future, but it's something that he's already been taking part of. It's something that he may have unconsciously been taking part of, but nonetheless, he's already pretty much a pro at it. And of course, this doesn't necessarily tell the full story, because even if you do know that you're taking part in this process called death, which we all are at all times, and even if you understand that it's not necessarily just some boogeyman in the future, but that, as Seneca says here, that final moment of the event of death is merely the last death of all of the deaths that are happening throughout our lives. Even if you understand these things, you're still going to potentially have that feeling of, ultimately I'm still heading towards maybe that final nail in the coffin, and I don't necessarily know what's going to happen there, and life's pretty tragic, and we suffer all the way through life, and then we die. What's going on there? We can all have these fears and anxieties around whether it is the process of death or the event of death at the end of our lives. But nonetheless, I think that what we really need to look at in order to complete the picture is this idea that Seneca is so insistent on, that we should seek first and foremost the goods of the soul, the goods that come forth from that spark of divinity, that spark of order that exists within you, that thing that calls you forward, that pulls you towards a greater state of being. There's something about that, and this is something that we find in so many different philosophies and religions from around the world, this idea that there's something within you that if you're able to listen to that something and have that guide you in life, there's something about that transcends the suffering and the death that happens in life. There's something about that allows you to transcend this thing called death, to overcome death. And even in this letter, Seneca has given us a whole bunch of examples of people from the past who overcame death, according to Seneca, meaning they lived an honorable life, and at the end, they did not give in to their fear of death, but they faced it head on, and they dealt with it by living according to their values and their principles right to the very end. That's it, living according to the goods of your soul right till the very end. And so we can start to see these themes coming through this letter here, where Seneca is essentially trying to say, listen, okay, understand that death is a process. It's not some scary thing that's coming on the future. It's something that we are always involved in. And the way that we overcome death, right, the way that we overcome the fact that we are constantly dying is by living a life of deep, deep meaning. How do we do that? Well, look at these great examples of people in the past who were able to do that, were able to shine as brilliant examples of dying honorably, right? Because right to the very last moment, they were living according to the goods of their souls, the principles, the values that they held. They showed us that you can overcome death by not giving in to your fear of death. And then the final thing that I'll say on this passage is just that Seneca says here, I think this is interesting. He says, "I prefer that you should read your own words rather than my letter, for then it will be clear to you that this death of which you are afraid is the last but not the only death." And the words that he's talking about is this quote that he gave from Lucilius. Might have been from Seneca, we'll see. He said, not single is the death which comes, the death which takes us off is but the last of all. So again, that idea that the death that takes us away, it's just the final death of all in our lives. And Seneca believes that this information is sufficient to give you all that you need to take away ultimately from this letter. Don't read the letter, just read these words. It's very, very important to understand this. So again, I hope that these ideas, repeating them, can help you to continue to think about how this relates to your life, what it means for you in your life, that death is a process rather than just this event on the horizon. I hope that you have a think about this and have a think about, meditate on what this might mean for the way that you perceive death and what it might mean for, the way that it actually helps you to live a fuller, richer life, having that understanding. So again, I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I'll talk to you next time.